The auction started at 0600, station time, and I was the only one who showed up without a buyer's badge. I had my work ID clipped to my chest, grease still dark under my fingernails from the overnight shift, and a cup of cold coffee from the vending machine on level 4. I was not supposed to be there at all. My shift supervisor, a heavy-limbed Keth named Oren, had told me the night before that I was wasting my lunch break. He meant it as a kindness, the way someone warns you not to touch a hot panel. He had looked at me with those wide amber eyes of his and said, very slowly, the way the conclave species tended to speak to humans, Dex, the humans bid on salvage lots sometimes, and sometimes they get lucky. But that ship is not lucky. That ship is a tomb. I had nodded. Then I had set my alarm 2 hours early, and shown up anyway. The auction lot was docked at Bay 9 Gamma, the end of the station where the ceiling leaked coolant, and the lights ran at about 60% because maintenance had not replaced the panels in 4 years. Everything in 9 Gamma was things nobody wanted. There were stripped engine housings stacked in wire cages. There were cracked habitat modules with their airlocks seized open. There were 3 rows of decommissioned haulers that smelled like burnt fuel and old sorrow. And then there was her. She sat at the very back of the bay, behind a temporary safety barrier that someone had put up more out of habit than out of real concern. She was long, much longer than I had expected from the lot description, which had listed her under a generic registry code and given her length as estimated 340 meters, unverified. She was black, not the flat matte black of painted hull plating, but a deep, layered black that seemed to pull light toward her and not give it back. Her hull was not smooth. It was covered in angular ridges and recessed channels that ran along her length in patterns I did not immediately recognize as either structural or decorative. She had no obvious gun ports, which was strange for something registered as a warship class. She had no visible engines in the back, in the way that conclave military ships always had their drives clustered and exposed. Everything about her was interior, tucked in, hidden. She had 2 hull breaches I could see from where I stood, one near the bow, roughly 3 meters across, edges blown outward from whatever had hit her. One midship, smaller, maybe a meter wide, the kind of hole that something had punched through from the inside. Both were cold, no gas venting, no heat signature, no active reaction. Whatever had happened to her had happened a long time ago. The auctioneer was a Threnody called Parrish. She was running the session from a glass booth above the lot and looked deeply bored. There were 6 other registered bidders present, and all 6 of them were standing at the front of the bay looking at the smaller lots, the ones with actual resale value. A Vorn scrap dealer named Gal had his team doing structural assessments on the decommissioned haulers. 2 Keth equipment brokers were examining the engine housings. Nobody was looking at Bay 9 Gamma's back wall. Nobody was looking at her. Parrish read the listing in a flat, professional tone. Registry unknown. Builder unknown. Class estimated as heavy military, possibly carrier adjacent. Propulsion non-functional. Power core in dormant state. AI core classified as non-responsive and presumed non-recoverable. Hull integrity at approximately 61%. No weapons systems verified as operational. Bidding to start at scrap weight credit value, 14,000 conclave marks. 14,000 marks. That was almost exactly what I had in my account. It was every credit I had saved in 3 years of working the overnight shift in Halvor 9's maintenance division. It was the money I had been saving to get myself off this station and onto something better, something with a bunk that did not vibrate when the heat exchangers cycled. I raised my hand. Parrish looked at me. She looked at my work ID. She looked back at her screen. Nobody else raised their hands. 14,000 to the human in Bay 9 Gamma, she said, with the mild tone of someone who had seen stranger things and was too tired to comment. Going once, going twice. The Vorn dealer, Gal, turned from the haulers to look at me. He was a big creature, 6-limbed, with a face that conveyed skepticism without effort. He said something to his assistant in Vorn dialect that I did not catch entirely, but the word he used for me translated loosely as, the soft one who collects problems. Sold, said Parrish. I walked to the payment terminal and transferred everything I had. I stood in front of her for a long time after the other bidders had left. Up close, the hull was even stranger. The ridges I had noticed from a distance were not random. They ran in interlocking diagonal patterns, and where they intersected, there were small recessed nodes, flush with the surface, that I could not identify as anything in my training. They were not sensor ports. They were not thruster nozzles. They were not heat vents. They were something else entirely, and they were placed with a precision that told me they were very much on purpose. I pressed my hand flat against the hull. It was cold, station cold, the same temperature as the air around it. Ships that have power running, even in standby, have warmth. Their cores bleed heat even when they are quiet. This ship had nothing. She was as cold as the void itself, which should have meant she was dead, and yet standing there with my palm against her I felt something I could not explain, and would not have tried to explain to anyone on that station. She felt patient. I found the external maintenance access panel near the bow, which was a standard conclave-compatible interface port, the one concession her builders had apparently made to interoperability. That told me something too. Whoever had built her had known about the conclave, had built in a way to communicate with them, but had built everything else in a way that was entirely their own. I ran a basic diagnostic through my handheld scanner. The power core read as dormant but intact. That was not what the lot description had said. The lot description had said the power core was condition unknown, likely depleted. It was not depleted. It was resting. There was a difference, and I knew that difference from years of working on machines that people had given up on too quickly. The propulsion system read as damaged but not destroyed. 3 of what my scanner interpreted as drive nodes were non-functional. The other 2 were in a state my scanner labeled as unknown operational status, which meant my scanner did not know what they were, not that they were broken. The AI core read as no signal detected. I looked at that result for a long time. No signal detected was not the same as non-responsive. It was not the same as dead. It meant my scanner was not receiving a signal, which meant either the core was off, or the core was shielded, or the core was transmitting on a frequency my equipment could not read. I closed the diagnostic. I stood up. I looked at the hull breach near the bow. I crawled inside. The interior of the ship was dark, but not completely. There was a faint phosphorescent quality to the inner hull material, something built into the composite that gave off just enough light to see by once my eyes adjusted. The corridors were narrow by conclave standards, which meant they were almost comfortable for me. A Keth would have had to turn sideways. A Threnody would not have fit at all. The proportions of the interior told me the builders were roughly human-sized, which was the first truly startling piece of information I had gathered, because there were not many species in the conclave that were human-sized, and none of them built ships that looked like this. The air inside was stale but breathable. The environmental systems had maintained a sealed atmosphere for however long she had been sitting in Bay 9 Gamma, which the lot records estimated at 40+ years. That was not an accident. A ship that holds breathable air for 40 years without active power is a ship designed to hold breathable air for 40 years without active power. I worked my way toward what I estimated was the center of the ship, following the main corridor, stepping over a section of collapsed ceiling near the midship breach without trouble. The interior was clean, no debris that did not come from the breaches, no sign of the crew, no personal effects, no indication of what had happened to the people who had flown her. Whatever end had come for them, it had not come aboard this ship. I found the bridge by accident, which is to say I followed the corridor until it opened up, and the room I stepped into was clearly command level. The ceiling was higher here. The floor curved slightly downward toward the center, like a shallow bowl, and around the curve, there were 12 stations arranged in a wide arc. Each station was a low console with surfaces that were dark, but not blank. They had texture. They had depth. They looked like they were waiting for input, rather than burned out. At the center of the bowl, at the lowest point of the curve, there was a single chair. It was not a throne. It was not elaborate. It was exactly the right size for someone built like me, with a high back and 2 armrests and a surface that, when I pressed my hand against it, was not cold the way the hull was cold. It was room temperature. I sat down in it. Nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. The ship had no power. I had been inside her for less than an hour, and already I was sitting in the captain's chair, expecting something cinematic to occur. I almost laughed at myself. Then, from somewhere deep in the ship, something made a sound. It was not loud. It was barely a sound at all. It was more like the feeling of a sound, a low harmonic that you felt in your chest before your ears registered it, the way very large machinery sounds when it is first thinking about starting. It lasted 2 seconds, and then it stopped. I sat very still. The ship did not make another sound. The bridge stayed dark. The 12 stations around me stayed dark. But I sat in that chair for another hour and did not feel even slightly like leaving. I went back to my bunk that night, and I did not sleep. I lay on my back and I thought about the sound, and I thought about the core temperature that was not depleted, and I thought about the stations that looked like they were waiting, and I thought about the fact that the builders were roughly human-sized and had put a conclave-compatible access port on the outside, while keeping everything else entirely their own. I thought about what Oren had said. That ship is a tomb. He was wrong about that. A tomb is where you put something after it is finished. That ship was not finished. I requested 3 days of personal leave the next morning. Oren processed it without asking why. He assumed, I think, that I had made a foolish purchase and was spending a few days quietly coming to terms with it. That was fine with me. I moved into the ship that afternoon. I brought my tools, my portable scanner kit, my diagnostic laptop, 2 changes of clothes, a sleeping bag, and enough food for a week. I sealed the hull breach near the bow with a temporary patch from the station's maintenance surplus. I ran power from the station's external grid into the ship's systems through the conclave interface port, just enough to run lights and run my equipment. I started at the power core. The core was in a shielded chamber 3 decks below the bridge, accessible through a ladder shaft that was slightly too narrow for comfort, but not impossible. The chamber itself was large, much larger than I expected for a ship this size. The core was not a fusion design, which was standard conclave propulsion. It was not an antimatter design, which the conclave's military ships used. It was something I did not have a category for, a structure about 4 meters in diameter, made of interlocking components, arranged in a pattern that my engineering instincts told me was generating a contained field of some kind, but that my scanner refused to classify. I sat in front of it for 2 hours just looking at it. Then I started taking notes. Not digital notes, paper notes. I had a notebook with a hard cover, and I filled 12 pages that first afternoon, with diagrams and questions and measurements. I wrote down everything I could observe, and then I wrote down what I thought each observation meant, and then I wrote down what questions that raised. It was the most alive I had felt in 3 years. On the second day, I found my first real surprise. I had been working my way through the corridors, mapping the ship's layout, and I had come to a section of the ship on the starboard side that my initial mapping said should be a secondary cargo space. I opened the access hatch, and it was not a cargo space at all. It was a room about 8 meters square, and every wall of it was covered in dense, intricate script, not carved, not painted, somehow embedded in the hull material itself, luminous in the same faint way that the corridor walls were luminous, but the script was brighter, organized, deliberate. I did not recognize the script. I took photographs of every wall. I ran the images through my laptop's translation database, which covered 42 conclave languages and 17 archaic variants. It found nothing, not a partial match, not even a structural similarity. Whoever had written on these walls had written in a language that the conclave's vast accumulated database of civilizations had no record of at all. I sat in the middle of that room for a long time. Then I did something I had not planned to do. I spoke out loud. Not to anyone in particular, just to the room, to the ship, because 3 years of working the night shift alone had given me the habit of talking to machines when nobody was listening. I don't know what this says, I told the walls, but I'm going to figure it out. I'm not going anywhere. The ship was quiet. The corridor outside was quiet. Station noise filtered in from far away, the distant hum of Halvor 9 going about its business. Then, from the bridge above me, came that sound again. That low, deep harmonic that was more feeling than noise. It lasted 4 seconds this time, then 5, then it stopped. I climbed the ladder to the bridge and stood in the center of the room and looked at the 12 stations in their arc. One of them was showing a single point of light. Just one, small as a grain of sand, steady, at the top left corner of the nearest console surface. I walked to it, and I leaned down close, and I looked at it. It was not a malfunction light. It was not a warning indicator. It was white, perfectly white, and it was absolutely steady, and it was in the exact position that any interface designer, from any species in the conclave, would place a cursor. It was waiting for input. My hands were shaking slightly when I pulled out my notebook. Not from fear, from the specific, narrow, electric feeling of standing at the edge of something enormous and knowing it is real. I pressed one finger gently to the surface of the console. The point of light moved. It followed my fingertip. Not immediately, not with a snappy digital response, but with the careful, deliberate movement of something that was paying attention. I moved my finger in a slow circle. The light followed. I stopped. The light stopped. I lifted my finger. The light returned to its original position and waited. I exhaled slowly. "All right," I said out loud. "We're going to take this one step at a time." Outside, through the hull, Halvor 9 went on being a station that had forgotten this bay existed. Oren was probably at his desk, assuming I was sulking. Gal the Vorn was probably appraising something actually profitable. The conclave, vast and ancient and deeply certain of what it knew, was going about the business of governing 1,000 worlds. None of them knew what I had just found. None of them knew what she was. But I was beginning to. I went back to my sleeping bag that night and I did sleep, finally, deeply and completely, for the first time in days. And the last thought I had before I went under was not about the power core, or the script on the walls, or the light on the console. It was about the sound. It had lasted longer the second time, and I was almost entirely certain, in the way that comes from years of listening to machines, that it had waited until I spoke before it made itself heard. I was not alone in that ship. I had known it since the moment I sat in the chair. I just needed her to know I knew. 3 weeks in, I had a name for her. It came from the script on the walls. I had been cross-referencing the photographed characters against every linguistic database I could access, and while no full translation had come through, I had found a partial phonetic match in an obscure academic paper about pre-conclave signal intercepts from the outer rim. The paper was 20 years old, authored by a Threnodi linguist named Dr. Oren Vass, who had spent a career trying to document civilizations that the conclave had officially classified as resolved, which was their clean word for gone. The paper mentioned a recurring character cluster in the intercepts that Oren Vass had tentatively transcribed as a sound roughly equivalent to the human syllables R and dent in sequence. He had noted that the cluster appeared most often at the beginning of longer phrases, which in most languages corresponded to either a name or a command. He had not been able to determine which. He had not known what language he was looking at. He had filed the paper. The conclave academic board had noted it without interest, and the whole subject had been set aside. The character cluster he had photographed matched the characters above the door of the room, with the writing on the walls. I had measured them against his photographs 3 times. I called her the Ardent. It fit. By that point, I had repaired the smaller of the 2 hull breaches, using composite bonding material I had requisitioned from the station maintenance supply, with a vague work order that Oren had approved without reading. The larger breach near the bow required structural reinforcement that I could not do alone, and I had not yet solved that problem. I had, however, managed to bring the ship's internal lighting fully online by rerouting power from the station grid through a modified coupling, and the difference this made was significant. She lit up from inside with the same faint phosphorescence that the hull naturally produced, but stronger, warmer, consistent. She looked less like a wreck and more like a ship that had decided to wait. The console on the bridge had not gone dark again. The point of light was always there when I climbed to the bridge, always in its waiting position at the top left, always ready to follow my finger. I had spent hours moving it around the surface, trying to understand what input the system was looking for. The console was not responding to pressure patterns I recognized. It was not a standard interface. It was also not completely alien, because it was clearly designed for beings with hands, with single contact inputs, with the kind of deliberate movements that came from conscious thought rather than reflex. I had started leaving my notebook open on the console and narrating my work aloud while I sat there. Not because I thought it was useful, but because it had become habit, and because on the 2 occasions when I had stopped talking and left the bridge in silence for more than about an hour, I had come back to find the point of light had shifted to the lower right corner of the console, as far from center as it could get, in a position that, if I was being completely honest, looked a great deal like something waiting to be noticed. I mentioned this to Vel on the 21st day. Vel was the Keth engineer who worked the morning shift in Maintenance Division 4, the one who had made a comment about my purchase on the day I bought the Ardent. She had said I was, in Keth phrasing, spending warmth on cold stone, which meant roughly what Oren had meant when he called it a tomb, but she had said it more gently. She was younger than most of the Keth on the station, only about 80 years old, which was young for her species, and she had a habit of following up her skeptical comments with actual questions, which is how I had ended up talking to her at all. She had started coming by Bay 9 Gamma after her shift, just to look. She had not said much at first. She had walked around the exterior, inspecting the hull ridges with the focused attention of a trained engineer, and then she had walked inside, looked at the bridge, looked at the script room, and stood in the corridor for a while without speaking. Then she had said, in very careful, neutral Keth engineering language, "The tolerance on these corridor walls is exceptional." Someone cared deeply about precision. That was Vel's version of being impressed. I told her about the point of light on the 21st day because I needed a second opinion, and she was the only person on the station whose opinion I trusted. We were on the bridge. She was looking at the console with the light. She was doing what she always did when she looked at technical things, which was standing very still and letting her eyes move systematically over every detail. "You think it is responding to speech," she said. "I think it is responding to presence," I said. "When I am here, the light is in the center. When I am not here, the light moves to the edge. When I talk, I sometimes hear the harmonic from below decks." "The core." "Yes." Vel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Show me." I sat down at the console. I put my finger on the surface. The light followed. I moved my finger in a slow arc. The light moved with it. Vel watched all of this, without any expression I could read. Then I said, in a clear, normal voice, "I am working on the drive node in Section 7 today. I think the calibration sequence is off by a resonance factor I have not been able to measure yet, but I am going to try a new approach." From below decks, the harmonic came. Low. 4 seconds. Then 5. Then 6. Then it faded. Vel did not move for a long time. Then she said, "That is not a passive system." "No," I said. "The core is not dormant," she said. "It is listening." "That is what I think," I said. She turned and looked at me with her wide amber eyes, and in them, I could see the specific, narrow, electric feeling I had been living with for 3 weeks, because Vel, who had told me I was spending warmth on cold stone, had just felt what I had felt the first night I sat in the captain's chair. She was in. I put her to work on the drive nodes that same afternoon. The drive system was, in Vel's professional assessment, philosophically different from anything I have trained on, which, from a Keth engineer who had been working on spacecraft since before my grandmother was born, was a remarkable thing to say. The drive nodes were not damaged in any way that corresponded to conventional failure modes. They were not burned out, not seized, not corroded. They were in a state that Vel described, after 2 hours of examination, as deliberately quieted, which meant someone had intentionally placed them in a state of minimum function, not to save them from damage, but to ensure they could not be activated without specific, correct input. "These are not broken," Vel said, from inside the access crawlway, where 2 of the nodes were housed. "They are locked." "Locked against what?" "Against the wrong person," she said. I thought about that. "Can you unlock them?" I asked. A pause. "I do not know yet what the correct input is, but I know what it is not. It is not any standard conclave drive activation sequence." I went back to the bridge. I sat down. I put my hands on the console and I looked at the point of light, and I said, "I need to know how to start the drive nodes. I do not know the unlock sequence. I do not speak your language, but I am still here and I am still trying, and I would appreciate any help you can give me." The harmonic came immediately, not the slow, cautious build I was used to. It came fast and full, and it lasted 12 seconds, and the entire bridge hummed with it, and when it faded, the point of light on the console had moved to the very center of the surface, and was pulsing, not blinking, pulsing. the way a living thing pulses. From below decks, Vel's voice came up the ladder shaft. "Dex, one of the locked nodes just changed state." "I know," I said. "I did not touch anything," she said. "I know," I said. I kept my eyes on the pulsing light. "What are you?" I said, quietly, more to myself than to the ship. The harmonic came back for exactly 3 seconds. Precise, contained, as close to an answer as anything without a voice could give. I had been sleeping in the ship for 3 weeks, and had not once felt afraid of it. I want to be clear about that, because when I describe what happened over the next months, it might seem like something that should have been frightening. It was not. It was the opposite of frightening. It was the feeling of a door opening into a room you did not know existed in a house you have lived in your whole life. And inside the room there is something that has been waiting for you, patiently, without resentment, simply waiting, because it understood that you would come eventually. The script on the walls of the room I had photographed so carefully began to make sense by degrees, not because I translated it, but because I started to see it in relation to patterns that appeared on the consoles, and the consoles responded when I interacted with certain pattern groupings, and the responses accumulated into a working vocabulary, the way vocabulary always accumulates, through context and repetition, and the willingness to be wrong and keep going. By the end of the second month, I had a working vocabulary of 43 terms. One of them was my name, not my human name, a designation the ship used for the input signature that corresponded to my presence. When I spoke it aloud, experimenting, the harmonic from below decks was the longest it had ever been. 22 seconds. Vel, who was by then spending more time on the Ardent than in her own assigned quarters, climbed to the bridge and stood in the doorway and looked at me with the expression she used when something had confirmed a hypothesis she had been reluctant to state. "It knows who you are," she said. "Yes," I said. "It has been tracking your patterns since you first came aboard," she said. "The speech, the touch inputs, the time intervals. It built a profile." "Yes," I said. "And it has been waiting to see if you were consistent enough to be trusted," she said. I looked at her. "How did you know that part?" She held up her own notebook. She had been keeping parallel records. She had cross-referenced the harmonic timings against my logged activities, and found a clear pattern. The harmonic was longer and more complex on days when I had solved a technical problem, and shorter and simpler on days when I had made an error and not corrected it. It had been scoring me. That night I sat alone on the bridge after Vel had gone to her bunk in the forward quarters, the ones we had cleaned out and set up properly in the 4th week. I sat in the center of the bowl, and I looked at the arc of consoles, 12 of them, most still dark, and I said, "I am going to fix you. All of you. And I think you already know that, and I think that is why you are still here. But I need you to know that I know, so we are not pretending." The harmonic came. It was not 12 seconds. It was not 22 seconds. It ran for over a minute, and it rose and fell in something that was unmistakably structured, something that had rhythm and variation and purpose. And at one point it resolved into a tone so clear and so sustained that Vel appeared in the doorway of the bridge with wide eyes and her notebook open, and we both stood and sat there and listened to it until it finished. When it was over, the bridge was very quiet. Then, all 12 consoles lit up at once. Not fully, not with all their displays active and their functions running. Just the surfaces, just the same faint phosphorescent glow that the hull and walls produced, the ship's own light, steady and patient, filling the bridge from 12 points of presence. Vel said nothing for a long time. Then, "I think we just passed the interview." I said nothing at all. I just put my hand on the armrest of the captain's chair and felt it. Room temperature, patient, alive in the only way that things built from purpose and memory and time can be alive. "Hello," I said. "I am going to call you Kale." From the core, 12 decks below us, something answered. On the morning of the 63rd day, 3 things happened in quick succession, and none of them were connected, and all of them would matter enormously later. The first was that Vel solved the drive node calibration problem. She had been working on it for 4 weeks, with results that were promising but incomplete. And then at 0430, While I was asleep in the forward quarters, she had a moment of clarity that she later described as finally understanding what the system was trying to tell me instead of what I was trying to tell it. And she had made 3 adjustments that nobody trained on conclave engineering would have thought to make, and 2 of the 5 drive nodes responded to a startup signal for the first time. The sound they made woke me from a dead sleep. It was not the harmonic. The harmonic was Kale's voice, if you could call it that. The sound of the ship's core responding to presence and input. The drive nodes sounded different. They sounded like power, not the clean electric hum of conclave drives, but something older and denser. Something that vibrated at a frequency that felt like the sound earthquakes make at the very start, before the shaking. The frequency the Earth uses when it is reminding itself that it contains enormous things. I was on the bridge in under 2 minutes, still in the clothes I had slept in. All 12 consoles were active, not in standby mode. Active. Displays were running in the Veth core script, updating in real time, showing data I could partially read by then and partially interpret from context. Kale's presence on the bridge was different in those moments. Denser, more immediate, like the difference between watching someone through a window and standing in the same room with them. Vel came up from below decks with oil on her hands and what I had come to recognize as her excited expression, which for a Keth looked almost exactly like her calm expression, but with a very slightly elevated blink rate. 2 of 5, she said. The other 3 need physical component work. I know what to do now. Another week, maybe less. How did you solve it? I asked. She thought about how to explain it. The nodes are not calibrated to an energy input, she said. They are calibrated to a pattern, a specific, repeating signal pattern that matches what the core produces when it is fully engaged. She paused. Kale was broadcasting the correct unlock pattern into the drive section continuously. The nodes were always ready to respond. We just had not been listening on the right frequency. I turned to face the bridge, to face the 12 lit consoles and the captain's chair at the center of the bowl, and I said, "You were waiting for us to listen correctly." The harmonic came, short and simple. 3 seconds. The Veth core equivalent of obviously. Vel, despite herself, made a sound that was the Keth version of a quiet laugh. The second thing that happened that morning was that Orin came to Bay 9 Gamma. He had not visited before. He had known I was spending my leave time there, and after I returned from leave and requested a modified shift schedule that gave me longer blocks of off hours, he had processed the request with the same incurious efficiency he brought to most administrative tasks. But that morning, perhaps because the drive nodes had produced a vibration felt in the station floor, or perhaps because someone on his team had mentioned something, he appeared at the bay entrance at 0730 and walked slowly through the bay toward the Ardent. He stopped about 20 meters away. He looked at her for a while. She looked different now than she had on auction day. The temporary bow patch had been replaced with proper composite work that was actually stronger than the original surrounding hull material. The internal lights were running, and the glow leaked from the smaller breach, which we had not yet sealed, giving her a warmth she had not had before. She had been cleaned. Every surface inside and out that could be accessed had been gone over until the station grime was gone, and only the ship's own material remained. She looked less like salvage and more like what she was. Orin stood in front of her for a long time. Then he said, loudly enough for me to hear from the access ramp where I was standing watching him, "What did you find, Dex?" "A ship," I said. He turned and looked at me, and in his wide amber eyes I saw something I had not seen there before, which was uncertainty. Orin was a creature of procedure and assessment. He knew his inventory. He knew his equipment. He knew, in a comfortable and well-maintained way, how the galaxy was organized and where everything fit. What he was looking at did not fit, and he knew it, and he was not sure what to do with that knowledge. "That is not a conclave ship," he said. "No," I said. "The drive nodes I felt this morning," he said. "Those were not conclave drives." "No," I said. He looked at the ship for another long moment. Then he said, in a careful, measured voice, "Be careful, Dex. Some things are in the salvage lots because they belong there, and some things are there because nobody knew what else to do with them." He left after that, walking back through the bay without looking behind him, and I watched him go, and thought that for a species that liked to speak slowly to humans as if we needed the extra time to understand, he had just said something quite quickly, that required no processing time at all. The third thing that happened that morning was the result I got from the Conclave Registry database. I had submitted a query 14 days earlier. Registry code from the Ardent's external interface port, run against the full Conclave historical database, with a request for any classification record at any level of access available to a civilian maintenance worker, which was not much, but sometimes the shape of what is missing tells you something useful. The result came back at 0910. The registry code was recognized. That was the first surprising thing, because the auctioneer Parrish had said it was unknown, and the lot description had said builder unknown, and that had been the official word. But the database recognized it. It just could not display the record it found, because the record was under a classification level that did not have a name in the civilian database, just a reference number and a single tag. The tag was, quarantined, do not engage. Authority, Conclave High Security Council. Below the tag was a note so old its timestamp format was not one my laptop could automatically parse. The note said, in plain Conclave standard, all vessels of this class and marking are to be considered beyond the scope of standard salvage law. Any civilian in possession of a vessel matching this registry profile is requested to contact Conclave Security Authority at the earliest opportunity. I read it twice. Then I took a screenshot, closed the database, and went back inside the Ardent and climbed to the bridge and sat down in the captain's chair. Kale's presence on the consoles was steady. The displays were running. The two active drive nodes were vibrating at the base of the ship with that deep, old sound. Someone in the Conclave knows what you are, I said. The harmonic came. And they quarantined the information. The harmonic again, slightly different in tone, slightly more complex, more than agreement. Something like confirmation with context, the way a person says yes, and there is more, before they say the harder part. I sat with that for a while. The Conclave was not a government that misplaced things. They were not a government that overclassified routine information. A Security Council quarantine tag on a ship registry was not a bureaucratic accident. It was a decision, made deliberately, by the highest level of Conclave authority, to ensure that anyone who stumbled across this information would not be able to pursue it without going through official channels that the Conclave controlled entirely. It meant that whoever the Ardent's builders were, the Conclave knew about them, had decided to suppress that knowledge, and had done so at the highest level available to them. It meant the Ardent was not just old and strange and technically extraordinary. She was classified. And I had bought her for 14,000 marks and moved into her living quarters. I put my hand on the armrest and I said, I am not contacting the Conclave Security Authority. The harmonic, short, simple, 3 seconds. The equivalent of, obviously. From below decks, Vel called up the ladder shaft. Dex, I think I know how to unlock the third drive node. Come and look at this. I got up from the chair. We had work to do. The first thing I should tell you is that the Conclave did not come to us. We went to them, in a manner of speaking, and the manner was an accident. 87 days after I bought the Ardent, on a Tuesday, by the old Earth calendar that I had kept running on my personal device out of habit, Vel solved the last of the drive node problems and brought all 5 online simultaneously. She did it at 1400 in the afternoon, station time, while I was on the bridge monitoring the console displays, and the moment all 5 nodes achieved synchronized output, the Ardent did something none of us had anticipated. She woke up completely. Every system on the ship came online at once, not gradually, not in the careful sequence I had been working toward, planning to bring each system up individually and test it before proceeding. All at once, every dark console lit, every display in the Veth core script started running at full speed. The lighting in every corridor went from the faint phosphorescent glow to a full, steady, warm illumination that made the ship look entirely different, made it look inhabited and purposeful and ready in a way that it had not looked before. And then, because none of that was enough, the passive defense systems engaged. I did not know the Ardent had passive defense systems. I had known she had weapons, because the lot description had mentioned non-verified weapons systems, but I had not found them in my months of working through the interior, and I had attributed that to the fact that there were sections of the ship I had not yet accessed. What I had not known, because nothing in my access to the ship's systems had given me this information yet, was that the Ardent had a separate category of systems that existed below the weapons level and above the basic environmental level. Systems designed to operate automatically and continuously whenever the ship was in a powered state. Systems that were neither offensive nor defensive in the conventional sense, but were something older and more fundamental, the ship's instincts. The passive defense systems did several things in the first 4 seconds after full power came on. They identified every powered object within 3 kilometers and classified each one by threat potential. They engaged a signal suppression field that blanketed the surrounding space with interference on all standard conclave communication frequencies, not jamming in the way that the conclave defined jamming, which was crude and detectable, but a far more sophisticated suppression that made the Ardent functionally invisible to all conclave sensor systems within that 3-kilometer range. Every proximity alarm, every docking sensor, every scanning array on Halvor 9 that was pointed anywhere near Bay 9 Gamma went from active to a state of quiet, confident, completely false normalcy. She had not broken their sensors. She had convinced their sensors that nothing interesting was happening. The Conclave patrol frigate that was currently docked at Bay 7 Alpha, about 400 meters away, had its targeting systems auto-polled by the Ardent's passive array, catalogued, and quietly placed into a file that Kale labeled, in the Veth core character set I had learned to read, with a word I had come to understand meant something like, observed and noted for later. This all happened in 4 seconds. On the 5th second, Vel came up the ladder from below decks at a speed I had not previously seen her manage. "Decks," she said, from the bridge doorway, with the expression she used when something had significantly exceeded her projections. "All 5 nodes are synchronized." "I know," I said, because I was watching it on the consoles. "The ship is doing things," she said. "I know," I said. "The docking sensor in Bay 8 Bravo just sent a routine no-event report to station control," she said. "I was connected to the sensor feed for monitoring purposes, and the sensor clearly has us in range. It should have flagged us. It sent no event." "I know," I said. She came to stand beside me and looked at the consoles. Kale's presence on the bridge was now so strong that it was almost physical, the way a large machine fills a room not just with sound, but with a quality of being there that you feel in your chest and in the back of your teeth. "Kale," I said. "Can you hear me clearly?" The harmonic came, but it was different this time, not from below decks, from the bridge itself, from the consoles, from the air in the room. Kale was speaking from the ship directly now, not from the core only. The sound had texture and variation that it had not had before, and under it, like a current, was something that sounded almost like words. Not words I could understand, but the shape of words, the rhythm of intentional communication. "We are going to have a conversation," I said. "But not today. Today I need to stand down whatever you just engaged in the surrounding area, because the station security system is going to notice the suppression field eventually, and I would prefer to handle this on my own terms." The harmonic from the bridge consoles continued for several seconds. Then several of the displays changed. The suppression field status, which I could now partially read, shifted from what I understood as active and continuous to what I understood as active but minimal. Vel was watching the same display. "It did not stand down," she said. "It reduced. It is giving me what it thinks is a reasonable compromise," I said. Vel considered this. "You are negotiating with a ship." "Yes," I said. "And it is negotiating back." "Yes," I said. She looked at the displays for another moment. Then she said, "What is the threat assessment file it has open on the patrol frigate?" I looked at that display. I could read enough of the character set now to parse the general category of what it contained. "It is logging the frigate's weapons specifications, shield capacity, drive output, and standard patrol patterns," I said. Vel was quiet. "It is not planning to engage it," I said. "It is cataloging it. There is a difference." "Is there?" she said. That was a fair question, and I spent some time thinking about it before I answered. The honest answer was, I did not know. I knew what Kale had shown me in the weeks of gradual communication, the patience, the careful observation, the willingness to respond to consistent and honest input. But I also knew that the ship had been built by a civilization the Conclave had seen fit to quarantine from all records, and that the capabilities it had just demonstrated in the first 4 seconds of full power were far beyond anything I had been expecting, and that whatever the Veth Corps had built this ship to do, they had built it very, very well. The patrol frigate docked at Bay 7 Alpha was a Conclave standard military vessel. It was crewed by approximately 60 beings, heavily armed by normal standards, capable of engaging most threats in Conclave space with high confidence. Against the Ardent at full power, the file Kale had just opened on it was labeled, in the Veth Corps script I had come to read, with a word I recognized. The word was noted. Not threat, not target, just noted, which was somehow both more and less reassuring than either of those words would have been. I put my hand on the console. I said, "Not yet. We do not engage anything yet. We are not ready." The harmonic from the bridge came back, and it had a quality I had not heard before, something that took me a moment to place because I was not expecting it. It sounded satisfied. Not with the situation. With me. 3 hours later, the station's external sensor array ran a routine sweep and flagged an anomaly in Bay 9 Gamma. Not the Ardent's power output, not the suppression field, not the drive node vibration. What it flagged was a heat signature that was slightly too warm for an empty bay, but slightly too cold for an active ship, a reading that corresponded to no category in the system's threat taxonomy, and therefore got logged as environmental irregularity, maintenance review recommended, and placed in a queue that the maintenance review team would probably not reach for another 2 weeks. The station's systems were looking for what they knew to look for. The Ardent was something they did not know. Vel looked at that maintenance flag on my laptop with the expression she used when a theory had been confirmed by data she had not entirely wanted to confirm. "She hid herself," Vel said. "She is very good at it," I said. "How long," Vel said slowly, "do you think she was doing this before we found her? How long was she sitting in this bay, in this condition, and hiding what she was?" I had thought about this question before. I had not arrived at an answer I was comfortable with, which is why I had not raised it yet. But Vel was asking it directly, and she deserved a direct answer. "I think," I said carefully, "that Kale was never not aware of where she was and who was around her. I think the dormant state was real, in the sense that the systems were genuinely in minimum function. But I think the core was always running at some level, and I think it was always observing, and I think the 40-plus years in the salvage bay were not a result of damage. They were a choice." Vel looked at me. "A choice." "She was waiting," I said, "for the right person to come along and buy her." Vel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the careful, neutral tone she used when she wanted to make a very precise point without drama, "And every other bidder at that auction passed." "Yes," I said. "And you did not," she said. "No," I said. Vel looked at the bridge, at the 12 lit consoles, and the captain's chair, and the displays running in Veth Corps script across every surface. "Dex," she said, "I want to be on this crew." I had been waiting for her to say that, since the day she had come down to the maintenance bay after her shift and told me the tolerance on the corridor walls was exceptional. "You already are," I said. She gave a short, satisfied nod, which for a Keth was equivalent to a significant celebration. Then she went back below decks to run diagnostics on the synchronized drive nodes, because that was how Vel showed enthusiasm. I sat in the captain's chair. The ship hummed around me, patient and awake and immense and old, in ways I was only beginning to understand. The displays ran in a language I could partially read, telling me things about our status, our power levels, our surrounding environment, all of it filtered through Kale's constant, thorough, unhurried awareness. I said, "I need you to show me how to fly you." The harmonic from the bridge came back, long and structured, and 3 of the console displays shifted to new layouts, simpler, more direct, oriented toward input rather than information. They were teaching displays. I pulled my chair closer to the nearest one, and I started to learn. In 2 weeks, the Conclave would find out the Ardent existed. But that is a story for what happened next, and what happened next began not with me, and not with Vel, and not with the Ardent. It began with 12 diplomats and a fleet. and a legal document that I was not going to comply with, and a decision the Conclave High Council had made in a conference room, somewhere in the center of their vast and ancient government, that they had not quite thought all the way through. Specifically, they had assumed I would say yes. That was their first mistake. I was in the middle of a navigation lesson when the official notice arrived. Kale had been walking me through the Ardent's positioning system, which was not a navigation system in the Conclave sense of the word. Conclave navigation was coordinate-based, point-to-point, managed by standard astronomical charts. The Ardent system was something else, a continuous, real-time awareness of surrounding space that Kale maintained independently, feeding into the helm controls, which responded not to programmed courses but to intent. You did not plot a path, you indicated a direction. Kale resolved the path, accounting for hazards and timing, and a dozen variables that would have taken a Conclave navigation computer several minutes to process, and that Kale handled in what felt like the time it takes to blink. I was practicing with small movements. Short adjustments within the docking bay, nothing that would be visible from outside, just getting the feel of the helm response, learning to stop pushing the system toward what I expected and start receiving what it was offering. Vel was at the starboard engineering station running cross-checks on the newly active systems. She had been doing this continuously since the full power-up, building a map of the Ardent's capabilities from the inside, noting everything that responded, everything that needed attention, everything that she did not yet understand, and needed to ask Kale about through the console interface. The notice arrived through the Conclave standard external port. It was marked urgent, official, and flagged for immediate acknowledgement. The flag system was designed to produce an audio alert, which it did, a short, flat tone from the console nearest the port. I looked at it. Vel looked at it. Conclave Security Authority, Vel read, from the header that was displaying on the port's own small screen. Reference: Registry Code Unknown. Subject: Salvage Override Protocol. I had heard of the Salvage Override Protocol. It was a mechanism the Conclave used rarely, and only in cases where civilian salvage activity was deemed to conflict with galactic security interests. It allowed the Conclave to retroactively void any civilian salvage claim and transfer ownership to Conclave authority, in exchange for the original purchase price, plus a standard compensation rate. In exchange for 14,000 marks and a percentage, they wanted the Ardent. I acknowledged the notice. Then I opened a reply field. I thought for a moment about what to write. Then I wrote, "I have received your notice. My response is no. The Ardent is mine. I have the receipt." I sent it. Vel read the reply over my shoulder. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the voice she used when she was being very precise, "That is going to escalate." "Yes," I said. "The Salvage Override Protocol carries legal enforcement authority," she said. "They can send a security team." "They can try," I said. From the bridge consoles, the harmonic came. Short, warm, 3 seconds. I turned back to the navigation lesson. The escalation, when it came, was faster than I expected, which told me the Conclave had been watching for exactly this response. Within 6 hours of my reply, a second notice arrived, this one from the Conclave High Council directly, which was a level of attention that the average salvage dispute absolutely did not receive. It informed me that the Salvage Override Protocol was non-negotiable, that Conclave security law superseded civilian property rights in all cases involving objects classified at or above security level Rho, and that I had 72 hours to transfer control of the vessel to the Conclave Security Authority representatives, currently en route to Halvor 9. Security level Rho. That was a classification designation I had not seen before. I looked it up. The public database had no entry for it. The Conclave's publicly available security classification system went from level Alpha at the low end to level Omicron at the high end. Rho was not on the list. Rho was beyond the list. Rho was something the Conclave had invented for things they did not want to discuss in terms of their regular security hierarchy. The ship I had bought for 14,000 marks was classified above the top of the Conclave's official security scale. I wrote back, no. 6 hours later, 12 Conclave diplomats arrived at Halvor 9. I know this because Oren came to Bay 9 Gamma personally to tell me, and Oren's face when he walked into the bay had an expression I had never seen on it before. The expression of a being who had just understood that something which had seemed like a small, eccentric problem had become a very large problem of a completely different character. "Dex," he said, "there are 12 diplomats in the station director's office, and 2 Conclave security corvettes in the docking queue." "I heard," I said. I had not heard. Kale had identified the corvettes the moment they dropped out of transit and had quietly catalogued their weapons systems, their crew complements, and their expected docking time, and had relayed this information to me through the console displays in a format I could now read fluently. Oren looked at me. He looked at the Ardent. He looked at the lit bridge, visible through the forward viewport that I had cleared of debris 2 weeks earlier. He looked back at me. "They are invoking security level Rho," he said. "I know," I said. "That is not a classification I have ever dealt with," he said. "It is not a classification most people have ever dealt with," I said. "Dex." He stopped. He recalibrated. He started again, with the care of someone who had decided to say something he was not entirely sure how to frame. "I have been a maintenance supervisor on this station for 19 years. In that time, I have seen humans do things that were unusual. I have seen humans fix equipment that other species had given up on. I have seen humans, sometimes, understand machines at a level that is genuinely difficult to explain, given the relative youth of your species. I am not, I want to be clear, someone who underestimates humans." He paused. "But," he said, 12 diplomats and 2 corvettes is not a maintenance problem. That is a conclave problem, and the conclave does not lose conclave problems." I appreciated him saying that. I genuinely did. I said, "I know, but here is the thing, Oren. They can send 12 diplomats, and they can send their 2 corvettes, and they can invoke security level Rho, and it is not going to change the fact that this ship is mine, and I am keeping her. So what is actually going to happen is a standoff, and my question is whether you want the standoff to happen here, where it is your station, or whether you want me to take the Ardent out to the edge of station space where it is technically nobody's jurisdiction, and have it there instead." Oren stared at me. "You are threatening to take the ship out," he said. "I am offering you the option of keeping this contained," I said. He stood very still for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was very carefully neutral, "The Ardent is in her berth. She has not been cleared for departure by station flight control. Any unauthorized departure would be logged as a violation." "Noted," I said. He left. Vel appeared from the starboard corridor where she had been listening with her notebook. "He is not going to stop us," she said. "No," I said. "He is going to document everything very carefully so that the liability is clearly established. And then, he is going to stand back." She considered this. "That is a reasonable approach." "Oren is a reasonable being," I said. The Galactic press arrived at Halvor 9 2 days later. I had not anticipated the press. The press had heard about the security level Rho invocation through Conclave administrative channels, because there were beings whose entire professional purpose was watching for exactly those unusual flags, and a security level Rho invocation on a civilian salvage lot at a minor outer rim station was the kind of thing that sat up and waved at those beings from across the galaxy. 3 independent news organizations arrived on the same transit corridor. A 4th arrived separately 12 hours later. By the end of the week, there were 11 journalists at Halvor 9, and the story they were running was not the story the Conclave had wanted told. The Conclave version of the story was routine security concern, civilian complications, proceeding through established channels. The story the 11 journalists found, because journalists are relentless when the official version smells wrong, was a single human mechanic, working alone on an overtime budget, had bought a ship classified above the top of the Conclave's security scale, had gotten it running, had refused to give it up despite the arrival of 12 official diplomats and 2 military vessels, and was currently sitting in it and saying no to the oldest and most powerful governing body in known space. That story spread in hours. I knew it had spread when I started getting personal messages through my civilian account from beings I had never met, on worlds I had never visited, who had seen the coverage and had opinions they wished to share. A significant portion of those opinions were variations of, "Good for you." A smaller but notable portion were variations of, "You are going to regret this." A very small portion were from beings in obscure academic positions who wanted to discuss the possible origin of the ship and were extremely politely desperate for any information I could provide. I read them all. I responded to the academics. The 12 diplomats requested a meeting. I agreed to the meeting and held it aboard the Ardent, in the forward reception area that Vel and I had cleaned and furnished with the 2 actual chairs we owned and a folding table from the station supply depot. The diplomats, who were a mix of 4 species and various levels of senior rank, had not expected this. They had expected to meet at the station director's conference room, on neutral ground, in conditions they controlled. Meeting on the Ardent was my ground, in conditions I controlled, and the ship's presence, alive and active and radiating that deep, old quality of something that had been built to be exactly what it was a negotiating variable I had not needed to explain to them. They felt it the moment they stepped inside. The head of the diplomatic delegation was a Threnody named Counselor Erish. She was tall even for her species, silver-scaled, with the precise and careful bearing of someone who had conducted a great many negotiations and won most of them. She was not used to losing. She was not used to sitting across a folding table from a human mechanic in a ship classified beyond her own security clearance and being told no. She told me, in extremely measured language, that the Conclave's position was firm. The salvage override protocol was legally binding. The ship was a security risk that no civilian could be permitted to manage. Compensation would be fair. There was simply no legal framework under which I could maintain possession. I said, "With respect, Counselor, the Conclave's position being firm does not make it correct." She looked at me with the expression of someone who had not been disagreed with recently and was deciding how to respond. I said, "The legal framework under which I maintain possession is the purchase contract I entered into in good faith at a Conclave-licensed salvage auction on a Conclave-administered station, conducted by a Conclave-certified auctioneer under Conclave salvage law, your own law. The salvage override protocol requires evidence of an active threat to galactic security. This ship is docked in a maintenance bay and has not engaged any offensive system. What is the specific threat?" She said the existence of the ship in civilian hands was the threat. I said, "That is a circular argument, Counselor. The threat is that I have the ship, and the reason I cannot have the ship is that it is a threat. I would like to see the Conclave's specific documentation of any action taken by this ship that constitutes a risk." She said the records were classified. I said, "I understand, but classified records that cannot be disclosed in the proceeding by which they are being invoked are not legally operative in civilian property dispute contexts under Conclave Salvage Statute 14, Section 8. I have read the statute." There was a pause. Then the counselor, who had not expected to spend her afternoon being quoted the Conclave's own statutes by a human in work clothes, said, with visible effort, "Are you trained in Conclave law?" "No," I said. I read quickly. Kale, from the ship around us, offered a brief, quiet harmonic that I was very grateful the diplomats could not interpret. The meeting lasted 3 hours and concluded with the counselor informing me that the Conclave would be pursuing alternative legal avenues, which was the diplomatic way of saying they had not finished with me but were going to need to regroup, and me informing her that I would continue to be reachable at my current address, which was the ship. Vel waited until the delegation had filed out through the airlock before she said, very quietly, "You told a Conclave High Council counselor that her argument was circular." "It was circular," I said. "You are going to be famous," she said. "I am already famous," I said. "There are 11 journalists outside." She had no response to that. She went back to the engineering station, and I went back to the navigation lesson, and Kale settled the ship into the specific, patient quiet that I had come to associate with its version of satisfaction, the quiet of something that has been waiting a very long time and is beginning to believe that the wait is nearly over. What came next was the part none of us had planned for. It was the part that came from outside the system, from beyond the rim, from beings who had watched the coverage of a standoff at a minor station and had made a calculation that the Conclave's hesitation meant weakness, and that weakness at a minor station could be leveraged into something much larger. Their name was the Grath, and they were about to make the worst mistake of their considerable military career. But they did not know that yet. And neither, entirely, did I. What I did know sitting in the captain's chair of the Ardent while the press filed dispatches and the diplomats regrouped, and the two conclave corvettes sat in their berths and calculated odds, was that Kale had been running targeting files on the Grath Armada for 4 days. I had not told Kale they were coming. Kale had known. Kale had known the moment their fleet entered the transit corridor, 3 days before they dropped to real space at the edge of the Halvor system, and had been quietly preparing. I had asked Kale, through the console interface, what it was preparing. The display had shown me a single Veth-Core character. I knew that character. It was the one that appeared most often in the writing on the room's walls, the one I had puzzled over the longest, before its meaning had become clear from context. It meant demonstration. I sat back in the captain's chair, and I let out a long breath. I thought about 14,000 marks, and a cold breakfast, and an auction no one else had bothered to attend. And I thought, all right, let us demonstrate. The Grath Admiral's name was Vendaka, and he came out of dark space with 400 ships. I know this because Kale had been tracking the entire armada since it entered the outer system, and the count came through the tactical display in precise, calm Veth-Core numerals. 407 vessels, to be exact, ranging from light escort frigates at the small end to 3 heavy capital ships at the center of the formation, arranged in a spread that was designed for maximum coverage, and that would, against a conventional conclave defensive arrangement, have been devastatingly effective. The conclave fleet at Halvor 9 at that moment consisted of the 2 security corvettes from the diplomatic mission, a logistics tender that had arrived 2 days earlier with supplies for the diplomatic team, and a patrol cruiser that had come through on its regular circuit and had been requested to remain pending the situation at Bay 9 Gamma. 4 ships, against 407. The math was not favorable by any standard. What Vendaka did not know, what his intelligence had not told him because his intelligence had been watching the conclave's numbers, and not the question of what was actually in Bay 9 Gamma, was that there was a 5th ship at Halvor 9. She was not listed in any current conclave fleet registry. She was not broadcasting any identification signal. The sensor suppression Kale had been running at reduced capacity since the full power-up meant that to Grath long-range sensors, the bay she was docked in had the signature of empty space. They had not seen her. They did not know she existed. Vel was at the engineering station when the Armada's position report came through. She looked at the numbers on the display and said, very calmly, the way she always said things she felt very strongly about, "We are not prepared for a full engagement." "We are not going to engage them in the conventional sense," I said. She looked at me. What other sense is there? I had been talking to Kale through the console for most of the previous night. The communication at this point was genuinely two-way, in a way that it had not been at the start. Not speech, not language, in the way a being uses language, but a kind of dialogue conducted through the displays and the harmonic and the movement of information between us that had become, after months of practice, natural enough to trust. Kale had shown me, over those hours, what the Ardent was built to do. Not the weapons, not the drive, the doctrine. The Veth-Core had built the Ardent around a philosophy of conflict that was different from the Conclave's philosophy, and different from anything I had encountered in my years working with Conclave equipment. The Conclave built warships to destroy threats. The Grath, from what I could read in Kale's tactical files, built warships to overwhelm threats with mass. The Veth-Core had built the Ardent to do neither of those things. They had built her to end threats without requiring their completion. The principle, as I had come to understand it through weeks of display reading and harmonic interpretation, was this: a battle that damages you costs you, regardless of who wins. The Veth-Core considered any battle in which they sustained meaningful damage to be a failure of method, not a victory. Their ships were built to make the enemy understand, before the first real exchange, that continuing was a worse option than stopping. Not through posturing, through demonstration, through the careful, precise application of what the Ardent's capabilities could show, rather than do, and through an understanding of the specific psychology of the species being faced. Kale had been running a profile on the Grath for 4 days. It knew their formation doctrine, their communication protocols, their response patterns to various threat classes, and several things about the specific psychology of Grath military culture that were encoded in the file, under a section I could only partially read, but that I understood to concern what the Grath feared more than anything else: the unknown. Grath military doctrine was built on certainty. You counted your ships. You counted theirs. You knew the exchange rates. You calculated and you committed. What broke Grath formations, historically, was not superior firepower. It was the emergence of a factor outside their calculation. It was the moment when the math they had done no longer applied. Kale intended to be that moment. I had agreed. And then I had asked Kale to show me, specifically, what it intended to do and in what order, because the Ardent's capabilities were mine, to authorize or not, and I was not going to hand that authorization over, not even to Kale, without understanding what I was authorizing. Kale had shown me. I had sat with it for a while. Then I had said, no one gets hurt. The harmonic from the bridge, long and structured, agreement with nuance. The Veth core doctrine was not about hurt, it was about understanding. No one dies, I said. The harmonic again. The same quality. Of course, the doctrine was not about death. Death was what you got when you ran out of better options. The Veth core had built ships precisely because they had not run out of better options. All right, I said. Let us do this your way. The Grath Armada had been in the Halvor system for 6 hours before they issued their demand. It was addressed to the Conclave fleet, which told me that Vendaka still did not know about the Ardent, and it was direct in the way that Grath military communication was always direct. Withdraw from the Halvor system in 1 hour, and leave the station open, or face engagement. They wanted the station. They had presumably wanted it for some time, and had decided that the Conclave's distraction at Halvor 9 was an opportunity. The Conclave patrol cruiser captain responded in the standard way, buying time, requesting clarification, putting the demand through official channels. The standard Conclave response to a superior force was delay and diplomacy. The Conclave was very good at both. But delay required something to delay for, and what the Conclave patrol cruiser was delaying for, in this case, was not a relief fleet, which was days away at minimum, but 1 ship in a maintenance bay, and 2 humans and a Kale. I sat in the captain's chair. Vel was at the helm secondary station to my right. She had said, when I had told her what we were doing, and roughly how, I want to be at the station when it happens. I had told her the station she wanted was the engineering console. She had said, with the precise, flat delivery she used for things she felt strongly about. I did not help wake this ship up to watch it from the engineering console. I had said she had a point. Kale released the docking clamps at 1414. Halvor 9's flight control system logged an unauthorized departure alert. The alert generated an automatic response query. Kale suppressed the query before it reached its destination. The station's alert system logged that the query had been sent and confirmed, and went back to monitoring other traffic. The Ardent moved out of Bay 9 Gamma for the first time. She moved slowly at first, navigating the station's docking architecture, and I felt it through the helm, that extraordinary quality of response, the way the ship understood intent rather than command. I wanted to be clear of the station. Kale found the path. The 2 active corvettes, the patrol cruiser, the logistics tender, all registered our departure on their sensors, and then registered nothing, because Kale's passive suppression field updated continuously to manage what we were presenting to every sensor in the area. We were a maintenance departure. Routine. No cause for concern. We cleared station space and went to full drive. The Grath Armada was 600,000 kilometers away at deployment spread, and they saw us in the same moment we cleared the suppression envelope and Kale chose to let them see us. 1 ship, black, long, not any class in their recognition system. From my helm display I could see Kale's real-time rendering of the Grath fleet's sensor returns. 407 ships, all of them suddenly adjusting their tracking arrays toward the single black vessel that had appeared from the direction of the station, and was now proceeding directly toward the center of their formation, at a speed that did not correspond to any drive class in their database. In Grath military command culture, an unknown approaching the center of your formation at impossible speed was a problem for which there was one immediate response. Target it and hail it simultaneously. If it answered the hail, you reclassified the problem. If it did not answer the hail, you engaged. They hailed us. I let Kale decide whether to answer. Kale did not answer the hail. 200 guns tracked the Ardent. I watched them on the tactical display, a field of red indicators, each representing a weapons lock, growing as we went deeper into the formation. More and more of the Grath ships were locking on. Their targeting systems were, presumably, waiting for the order to fire. The order did not come. This was, Kale had explained to me in the previous night's discussion, the first demonstration. The Grath were expecting a response. Any response. The absence of response was a data point their tactical systems did not have a category for. A ship that approached 407 armed vessels without responding to hails was either a drone, a decoy, or something that had no reason to be concerned about 407 armed vessels. The third option was the one their commanders were currently debating, and the debate was doing exactly what Kale intended it to do. It was occupying their decision-making process at exactly the moment when occupying their decision-making process was most costly. We passed through the outer edge of the formation. No one fired. We were inside the formation now, moving at speed. The inner ships were adjusting to track us, their formations disrupted by the need to avoid firing angles that would endanger Allied vessels. Then Kale did the second thing. Every Grath ship's communication array received a signal, not a hail, not a broadcast, a targeted transmission, individual to each ship, arriving simultaneously across all 407 vessels. The signal was in Grath military encoding, which Kale had extracted from 4 days of listening to their encrypted communications, and it carried a single piece of information: the full technical specifications of the Ardent's weapons systems. Not a threat, not a demand, just the specifications. What she carried, what it could do, what the effective range was, what the yield was, what the targeting resolution was, the kind of information you would put in a weapons system report if you wanted someone to understand very precisely what they were facing. The specifications were, by Grath standards, impossible for a single ship. The Grath fleet went quiet. Vel, at her station, said very quietly, "They have stopped adjusting their tracking arrays." "Yes," I said. "They are not firing," she said. "No," I said. "And they are not hailing us again," she said. "No," I said. "The hail, when it came, was not from the fleet. It was from the flagship, from Vendaka personally. It came on an open channel. Not the encrypted military channel they had been using, open, which meant it was going to every vessel in the fleet, and to the station behind us, and to the 2 corvettes, and the patrol cruiser, and the 11 journalists on Halvor 9, who had their monitoring equipment running." Vendaka's voice was steady. "I will give him that. The Grath were not a species that let fear enter their voices easily," he said. "Identity of unknown vessel. Identify yourself." I looked at Vel. She looked at me. I pressed the transmit control. I said, "My name is Dex Morrow. I am a mechanic from Halvor 9. You are operating in Conclave space in violation of 3 separate Conclave territorial statutes, and I am requesting that you withdraw your fleet to the transit boundary within the next 30 minutes. There was silence on the open channel. Then Vendaka said, "What species are you?" "Human," I said. More silence. Then, in a voice that was not quite steady anymore, "One ship, crewed by humans." "2 humans and an AI, I said. "Take your time with the calculation. I will wait." Kale, from the bridge around me, offered the harmonic it made when it was satisfied. The Grath fleet began to withdraw 14 minutes later. They did not do it quickly. They did it in formation, maintaining their configuration, preserving the appearance of a controlled decision. Vendaka did not speak on the open channel again. His withdrawal orders came through the fleet's internal military frequency, which Kale was monitoring and translating for me in real time on the secondary display. The orders did not say retreat. They said, in Grath military phrasing, tactical repositioning pending command evaluation, which was the Grath way of moving away from something without admitting you were moving away from it. I respected that. I understood that. I sent no further transmissions. We let them leave. Vel, when the last Grath ship had cleared the transit boundary, said, in a very quiet voice, "We just repelled 407 ships." "Kale repelled 407 ships, I said. "I provided authorization." She turned and looked at me with the particular expression she had developed over the months, the one that meant she was revising a hypothesis significantly upward. "Dex," she said. The 11 journalists on that station recorded this entire engagement on open channel. Yes, I said. Every word you said is going out on galactic feeds in approximately the next hour, she said. Yes, I said. She looked at the display where the last Grath ship had been and said, I want a larger bunk. The patrol cruiser hailed us 17 minutes after the last Grath ship left the system. The captain was a Threnody named Oren, senior enough to have experienced things and wise enough to know when the experience she was having was genuinely new. She said, on the official channel, Halvor 9 registry vessel, please identify and confirm your armament. I said, my name is Dex Morrow. I am the owner and captain of the Ardent, and we will be returning to Bay 9 Gamma. I would appreciate it if Station Flight Control processed our return as routine. A pause. Then Oren said, confirmed. Welcome back, Captain Morrow. Captain. That was new. I had not used the word myself. I did not correct her. We brought the Ardent back to the bay and docked. Kale settled the clamps and quieted the drives, and the bridge returned to its steady, warm, patient state. I sat in the chair and looked at the 12 lit consoles and felt the ship around me, alive and capable and old in ways I was still learning. Vel was already at the engineering station, running post-engagement diagnostics, because that was Vel. From the bay entrance, I could hear the sound of journalists arriving. More of them now than before. Many more. The story they were going to file was not the one about a human mechanic refusing to give up his ship. It was bigger than that now. And somewhere in the Conclave's records, in the files sealed under security level row and the tag that said quarantined, do not engage, there was information that someone had decided should not be known, about a civilization that had built ships like the Ardent, and then departed from known space, and the question of why they had departed, and what they had left behind, and whether it was an accident or a purpose. I had 3 days before the answer to that question arrived in my communications queue, and when it did, it would not come from the Conclave. It would come from Kale, and it would change everything I thought I understood about why I was here. The Conclave dropped the legal challenge on a Wednesday. There was no announcement, no formal statement, no diplomatic communication marked urgent and flagged for immediate acknowledgement. One morning, the case reference number in the salvage override proceedings simply moved from active to withdrawn, and the 12 diplomats were gone from Halvor 9 before I had finished my first cup of coffee. The 2 corvettes departed 12 hours later. No explanation, no farewell. The station director sent me a brief, bland message informing me that the Ardent's berth in Bay 9 Gamma had been reclassified from temporary salvage to registered long-term docking, with appropriate fees to be invoiced at standard rates. Oren stopped by the bay that afternoon. He stood at the entrance, which he had not crossed since the day he came to warn me, and he looked at the ship for a long time. Then he said, "Congratulations, Dex." "Thank you, Oren," I said. He nodded once and left. That was his version of a significant celebration, and I was glad to have it. The galactic press did not leave. 4 of the original 11 had departed when the legal standoff ended, but 7 remained, and new ones had arrived, because the Grath withdrawal had made the story significantly larger than the story it had been before. The Grath fleet had gone home, and Vendaka had made no public statement, which was itself a statement, because Vendaka was not a being who lost publicly without saying something about it. His silence was news. His silence combined with the open channel recording of the exchange, which had been distributed across every major galactic feed within hours, was a story that was going to be discussed and analyzed and argued about for a very long time. The analysis, as far as I could follow it, was landing in 2 places. One place was the humans. Not me specifically, the species. The Conclave's various academic and political circles were suddenly running a great many articles and discussions about the humans, about how long they had been in the Conclave, about what they had and had not been permitted to do, about whether the assessment of humans as the young species still corresponded to observable reality, about what it meant that a human mechanic, without official support, without military training, without anything except determination and time, and the willingness to sit in a cold ship until she answered, had done what he had done. I read those discussions. Some of them were very uncomfortable. Some of them were very kind. Most of them were having an argument about something they did not entirely understand, because the part they kept missing, the part none of the analysis quite captured, was that I had not done it alone. I had done it with Kale. And Kale was the part that mattered, the variable that made everything else possible. But Kale was not in the public discussion yet. Kale was still, as far as the galactic press was concerned, a ship's AI of unknown classification. No one had grasped, or at least no one had published, what Kale actually was. The other place the analysis was landing was the Veth Core. 3 separate academic papers were filed within a week of the Grath engagement, all from researchers in obscure corners of conclave academia who had spent careers on the margins of the officially recognized historical record, looking at things the conclave had classified or set aside, or simply decided not to pursue. They were careful papers, hedged and qualified, but they all arrived at the same conclusion in their cautious academic way. The ship that had appeared at Halvor 9, the ship whose registry matched a security-level row quarantine tag, was of Veth Core origin. And the Veth Core, who the Conclave's official record described as a resolved civilization, were not resolved in any of the definitions that word usually covered. They had not been assimilated. They had not declined. They had not been lost to catastrophe. They had left, voluntarily, deliberately, at a specific moment in Conclave history that the researchers, to the extent they could date it, placed at approximately 400 years ago. They had left, and the Conclave had sealed the records. The question of why they had left, the question every paper circled without quite landing on, was the question I brought to Kale on the evening of the day the Conclave's legal challenge was withdrawn. I was alone on the bridge. Vel was in her quarters on the other side of the ship, the better quarters she had claimed after the engagement, with an absolute certainty that I had not challenged. The station sounds filtered in from outside, softer than they used to be, because the reporters had been pushed back to a media staging area that Oren had established with his characteristic procedural efficiency. I sat in the captain's chair, and I put my hands on the armrests, and I looked at the 12 lit consoles, and the Veth Core displays running their continuous data. I said, "Kale, I need to know what you have been transmitting." The harmonic came immediately. Full, warm, structured, no hesitation. I had known Kale was transmitting something since the early days, since the first time I had run a full sensor sweep of the Ardent's own systems and found a low-power signal output that did not correspond to any of the systems I had identified. It was not a broadcast. It was a tight beam, directional transmission, aimed at a point in space I had plotted, but could not identify as any known location in the Conclave's stellar maps. I had not asked Kale about it before, because the time for that conversation had not been right before. The time was right now. The display shifted. New information, in the Veth Core script, arranged in the teaching format that Kale used when it wanted me to understand something completely, rather than partially. I read it slowly. Then I read it again. Then I sat back in the chair, and I did not speak for a long time. The Veth Core had left because they had finished what they came to do. Not because they had been driven out. Not because the Conclave had threatened them, though in the records Kale was showing me, the relationship between the Veth Core and the Conclave in the final years before their departure had been tense in ways the Conclave's sealed records acknowledged but did not explain. They had left because they had decided that the galaxy, at that point in its development, did not need them. They were a civilization that had a particular understanding of what civilizations required in order to grow, and what they required, in the Veth Core understanding, was room. Room to make their own mistakes and correct them. Room to develop their own solutions to their own problems, without a vastly older and more capable civilization providing answers before the questions had been fully understood. The Conclave had not wanted them to leave. The quarantine on the records was not to hide the fact of the Veth Core's existence. It was to manage the story of their departure, to frame it in terms that would not raise the question of why the most capable civilization in known space had looked at the Conclave and decided, politely but firmly, to stop being part of it. They had left their ships behind. Kale showed me this part of the record in careful detail. They had left specific ships, not all of them, at specific locations, not abandoned, not decommissioned, placed, with their AI cores intact, their systems in the carefully maintained dormant state I had found the Ardent in, their passive systems running at minimum capacity, waiting. The ships were a test. Not a test of technical capability. The Veth Corps had left the technical capability in the ships themselves, so the test was not about whether someone could figure out how to access it. The test was about something else. It was about whether, in the centuries after their departure, any species in the galaxy would demonstrate the combination of qualities the Veth Corps considered essential for what came next. The qualities Kale listed, in the Veth Corps character set, were ones I could read fluently now. Persistence. The willingness to stay with a problem after the easy readings had been exhausted. Honesty. The refusal to impose a preferred interpretation on evidence that contradicted it. Regard. The specific quality of treating a thing as a partner rather than a tool. And one more, the one Kale's display showed last, the one I sat with the longest. Patience. The Veth Corps kind, which was not the patience of waiting. It was the patience of being present, fully, without agenda, until the thing you were with trusted you enough to show itself completely. I thought about a cold ship in a cold bay, and a point of light that followed a finger, and a harmonic that got longer when I solved problems and shorter when I made errors without correcting them. I thought about 40+ years of waiting. I said, "The signal you have been transmitting, is it reporting that the test was passed?" The harmonic, long, warm, structured. "Yes," I said. "And where is it going?" The display shifted one more time. It showed a stellar coordinate that was not in any conclave chart. A point in space, far from the rim, in a direction that the conclave had not explored. And on the tactical display that Kale kept running continuously, in the column that tracked incoming contacts, there was a new entry. It had appeared 3 days ago. I had seen it and asked Kale what it was, and Kale had, in the way of a good teacher, indicated that I should wait until I was ready to understand the context before I understood the contact. The contact was moving toward us. It was moving at a speed that the ardent sensors, the most sensitive in the Halvor system by a significant margin, could detect but not quite fully characterize, because the speed was outside the parameters the sensor array had been built to measure. It was very fast. Faster than anything in the Conclave's drive catalog. Faster than anything I had seen in Kale's technical library, which included the Ardent's own maximum drive output. The contact had been moving for 4 days. At its current speed, it would reach the Halvor system in 6 days. From somewhere in the ship, from the quarters on the far side of the hull, I heard Vel's voice. "Dex," she said, and her voice had a quality in it that I had not heard before in all the months we had worked together. Not excitement, not anxiety, but the specific, narrow, absolute attention of someone standing at the edge of something so large they could not yet see the far side. She was looking at the tactical display from her quarters. She had seen the contact. "Yes," I called back. "That contact," she said. "Yes," I said. "It is not Grath," she said. "No," I said. "It is not Conclave," she said. "No," I said. A pause. "Dex," she said. "What did Kale signal?" "The result of the test," I said. I waited. From across the ship, Vel said, in a voice that was perfectly steady. "And the result was?" I looked at the captain's chair. I looked at the 12 lit consoles. I looked at the character on Kale's display that I could read as clearly as any word in any language I had ever known. "We passed," I said. The harmonic from the bridge came then, the longest it had ever been. It rose and fell in the structured, purposeful way that music rises and falls, and it filled the ship from the core to the tip of the hull, and it said something that was not words, and was not translation, but that I understood the same way I had understood the quality of patience, in a cold ship in a cold bay, on the first night I sat in the captain's chair. It said, finally. 6 days was not a long time. It was long enough to prepare. It was long enough to sit in the captain's chair and look at the displays and run through everything I knew, and everything I did not yet know, and long enough for Vel to run her diagnostics, and write her notes, and sharpen her understanding of every system on the Ardent, in the careful, thorough way she did everything. It was long enough to be ready. On the morning of the 6th day, the contact entered the Halvor system. Every sensor array on the station registered an anomaly. Every ship in the vicinity registered an anomaly. The 11 journalists remaining at Halvor 9 registered an anomaly, and their monitoring equipment began recording without prompting, because that is what monitoring equipment does when something unprecedented walks through the door. Kale lifted the suppression field. Not reduced it, lifted it entirely. The ardent, black and long and patient, became visible to every sensor in the Halvor system, at the same moment that the contact resolved on those same sensors into a shape that did not match any known configuration. I sat in the captain's chair. Vel sat at the station she had claimed, to my right. The ship was warm and lit and alive around us. The contact hailed us. Not on a conclave frequency, not on a Grath frequency, on the frequency Kale's core operated on the frequency that the Veth core's own technology used, that had been transmitting for 4 days toward a point in space beyond the galaxy's known maps, the same frequency the Ardent had been quietly maintaining since her engines first lit on the day Vel solved the calibration problem. I looked at Vel. She gave me the nod she used when she had decided something and was settled in it. I pressed transmit. The voice that came through was not in any conclave language. It was not in Grath. It was in Veth core, which I could not speak, and Kale translated it through the display in the character set I could read, and what it said, in the language of a civilization that had decided the galaxy needed room to grow, and had waited 400 years to see if it was ready, was this. We received the signal. We are here. Who is the crew of our ship? I looked at the display. I looked at the words. I thought about a 14,000 mark receipt and a cup of cold coffee, and a cold ship in a cold bay, that had felt, from the very first moment I pressed my hand against her hull, like something waiting to be found by the right person. I said my name. I said Vel's name. I said what we were. And then, because Kale was ours as much as we were Kale's, and because the Ardent was a ship, and a ship needs a captain, and a captain needs to be honest about what they know and what they are, I said the thing that was true. I said, we are not soldiers, and we are not diplomats. We are a mechanic, and an engineer, and an AI that has been waiting a very long time, and we did not know we were taking a test. We just found a ship that nobody else wanted, and we stayed until she trusted us. The display showed Kale's translation of what came back. It said, that is exactly what we were waiting for. The station behind me was recording everything. The journalists were filing simultaneously. The Conclave's corvette captain was on a priority channel to the High Council. Vendaka, wherever the Grath Admiral was, would read about this within hours. 3 worlds that had sent formal envoy requests to the Ardent were going to have a great deal more to think about. And somewhere in the records the Conclave had sealed for 400 years, under a security classification that went beyond the top of their official scale, there was a file that had been waiting for this moment, as patiently as the ship had been waiting in Bay 9 Gamma. I did not know what was in that file. I did not know what came next, in the specific and practical sense of the word, but I was sitting in the captain's chair of a ship that had waited 40 years for the right person to come and sit in it, and the right person, it turned out, was a grease-stained human mechanic who had spent 14,000 marks and 3 years of savings on a morning when nobody else had shown up. I was, by any reasonable measure, exactly where I was supposed to be. From the console in front of me, Kale ran its harmonic one more time. Not long, not complex, just 3 seconds of that deep, warm, patient tone. The equivalent, in any language, of home.